Imagine you are standing on the bridge of a Soviet tanker in the middle of the Pacific, the sky black and the sea rolling under a low moon. You have sailed from the Black Sea, through the Mediterranean, across the Indian Ocean, and now you are headed toward the coast of China with tens of thousands of barrels of fuel in your tanks. You wear the red star on your cap. You have listened to years of lectures about the superiority of socialism, but every time your ship has stopped in a foreign port, you have caught a glimpse of a different world. Neon lights, crowded shops, stores full of goods that your family back home has only heard about in rumors. On board your ship, there is always the same warning. Do not talk to foreigners. Do not visit places you are not authorized to go. Do not bring Western magazines or radios back on board. And above all, do not run. If you run, you are not just a deserter, you are a traitor. Back home, they say, traitors disappear into prisons and camps. Their families are punished with them. Now imagine that without warning, the calm of that night is shattered by the thunder of naval guns. Shells crash into the water ahead of your bow. Searchlights slice across the waves and lock onto your ship. Foreign warships flying the flag of an enemy regime order your captain to stop. In a matter of minutes, your world is no longer the Soviet Union versus the capitalist West in theory. You are living that conflict with your own life on the line. This is the story of Soviet defection at sea, of men caught between two systems, Stalin's and then Khrushchev's Soviet Union on one side and the free world on the other, with the ocean as the only border. It is a story of fear, courage, betrayal, and sometimes of American technology and American law stepping into the picture at exactly the moment when one man tried to break away from an empire. During World War II, the Soviet Union built up a large merchant fleet to carry supplies, raw materials, and weapons across dangerous seas. After the war, that fleet did not shrink, it grew. Under the central shipping organization known as Sovtorgflot, Soviet tankers, cargo ships, and passenger liners began visiting ports on every continent, from London to New York, from Rio de Janeiro to Yokohama. They carried oil and grain, machinery and coal, and, just as importantly for Moscow, they carried the Soviet flag into places where Western media, Western products, and Western ideas were everywhere. For the people in charge in Moscow, that was a problem. Soviet citizens who saw too much of the outside world might start asking dangerous questions. Why do the shops in these decadent countries look better stocked than ours? Why are there so many private cars on the streets? Why are people allowed to criticize their own governments in newspapers and on television without disappearing? And if life is really so miserable under capitalism, why do their ports look so alive, so modern, so full of technology and goods? The answer from the Soviet leadership was to turn the merchant fleet into a floating version of a closed society. Mariners were screened politically before being assigned to foreign-going ships. On many vessels, there was an official political officer or an undercover KGB representative whose job was to monitor conversations, report suspicious behavior, and make sure nobody slipped away in port. Passports could be held by the captain or the political officer. Shore leave was tightly controlled, and contact with locals was restricted to formal events, receptions at consulates, guided tours, visits to friendly factories or cultural sites. But the sea, by its nature, is fluid. Ships come and go under many flags. Harbors are places where people from all over the world rub shoulders. And even in the most tightly controlled system, there are always moments when the watchman looks the other way, when a story leaks through a crack, when a man sees enough to decide that he will risk everything for a different life. The most extraordinary of these moments did not begin with a sailor jumping overboard. It began with a warship opening fire on a Soviet tanker. The ship was called the Tuapse. It would become the center of a Cold War drama that pulled in Moscow, Washington, Taipei, and a crew of 49 men who found themselves thrust into the role of pawns and, in a few cases, defectors. In June of 1954, the Tuapse left the Black Sea port of Odessa, steamed to the Romanian port of Constanța, and loaded more than 11,000 tons of kerosene destined for the port of Shanghai and then for Vladivostok in the Soviet Far East. Poland and Czechoslovakia had already seen some of their commercial ships inspected or seized by the Navy of the Republic of China, the nationalist regime now based on Taiwan, as it tried to block supplies to the communist government in Beijing during the first Taiwan Strait crisis. Now, the Tuapse was sailing into the same dangerous waters. After stopping in Hong Kong to refuel and take on provisions, the tanker headed into the Luzon Strait between the Philippines and Taiwan. There, on June 23, it met a squadron of Taiwanese warships commanded by Admiral Ma Zhizhuang and acting under orders authorized personally by Chiang Kai-shek, intercept any ships believed to be carrying strategic cargo to the People's Republic of China. When the Soviet captain refused signals to heave to, the Taiwanese destroyers fired warning shots across the bow and then live rounds close enough to make it clear that this was not a bluff. Armed boarding parties swarmed onto the Tuapse. Accounts collected later from both Taiwanese and Soviet sources describe sailors being beaten with rifle butts, a frantic attempt by engineers to disable the ship's engines, and a desperate attempt but unsuccessful effort to protect the Soviet flag from being torn down. Within hours, the Tuapse was under foreign control, being escorted to the port of Kaohsiung in southern Taiwan, its crew effectively prisoners, and its cargo of kerosene now a prize of war in a conflict they had never expected to fight. For Moscow, the incident was a shock. The Soviet Union immediately protested at the United Nations, calling the seizure piracy and a violation of the freedom of navigation on the high seas. Soviet diplomats accused Washington of orchestrating the action behind the scenes, arguing that without American backing, Taiwan would never have dared to intercept a Soviet ship in international waters. The United States, for its part, insisted that this was a unilateral action by the Republic of China, and American forces had not participated, a position that carefully tried to avoid direct confrontation while still keeping a staunch anti-communist ally afloat. Behind those telegrams and speeches, however, were 49 very real human beings. The crew of the Tuapse, including one woman, a bartender named Olga Popov, were taken off the ship and split into 3 groups according to age: young, middle-aged, and older sailors. They were housed in separate compounds under military guard, forbidden to speak with one another, and subjected to intense questioning by Taiwanese intelligence officers and, in some instances, by visiting Western advisors. On paper, they were guests of a regime that called itself the Free China. In reality, they lived behind fences, under armed watch, with no clear idea whether they would ever see home again. Their captors put a simple choice in front of them. You can go back to the Soviet Union, or you can stay in Taiwan as political refugees. For men raised in a system where defection was treason, where rumors of gulag camps and secret police were whispered but not spoken about, this was not a simple choice at all. Some of them had already seen enough of the outside world to know that the Soviet picture of capitalist decay did not match reality. They had walked the streets of Mediterranean ports where consumer goods filled shop windows, seen brightly lit advertisements, watched American or British ships unloading tractors, cars, and machines built with a level of industrial polish that impressed even experienced engineers. They knew that while their families stood in line for basic items, Western households were filling their homes with appliances, radios, refrigerators, even the new miracle of television. But others had deep roots back home: parents, wives, children, a lifetime of propaganda telling them that the West was not only hostile, but decadent and spiritually empty. Even if they wanted to stay, what would happen to those they left behind? And if the Soviet Union survived another 50 years, could they accept being officially branded as traitors forever? The pressure went in both directions. Soviet radio broadcasts and Red Cross messages demanded the immediate release of all crew members, asserting that every man wanted to come home and was being held against his will. Taiwanese officers, on the other hand, offered freedom and a new life, but only if the sailors signed public declarations condemning the Soviet regime and praising Chiang Kai-shek's Free China. Some interrogations turned violent. Reports speak of beatings and harsh treatment for those who refused to cooperate. After months of standoff, diplomatic channels finally produced a first compromise. In July 1955, about 29 members of the crew, including the captain, Vitaly Kalinin, were allowed to leave Taiwan and return to the Soviet Union via Hong Kong and Moscow. They were greeted at home as heroes who had suffered at the hands of pirates and reactionaries. There was a state-approved press campaign with carefully staged interviews in which sailors spoke of mistreatment and affirmed their loyalty to the motherland. But that was only half the story. The men were also subjected to intense debriefings by Soviet security organs, and archival records uncovered after 1991 show that many of them were kept under suspicion for years, their careers damaged by the mere fact of having been exposed to the West and to the possibility of defection. The Soviet state could publicly demand their return and denounce Taiwan, but it never fully trusted those who had spent time beyond its direct control. For the 24 or so sailors who did not get on those planes back to Moscow, the path ahead was even more uncertain. Some of them genuinely wanted to avoid the fate they imagined awaited them at home: prison, forced labor, or worse. They agreed to appear in Taiwanese propaganda events, to give statements denouncing communism, and to consider resettlement in third countries. Others wavered, changing their minds more than once as months turned into years and hope for a normal life seemed to recede. One group of 4, identified in later rehabilitation documents as L.F. Onfilov, Vladimir I. Benkovich, Pavel V. Gvozdik, and N.W. Zibrov, accepted an unusual deal. In 1957, they left Taiwan with Polish passports, traveled to Brazil, and then moved on to Uruguay, where they presented themselves at the Soviet consulate and declared a desire to return to their homeland. If they imagined that the Soviet authorities would show understanding or gratitude that they had come back, they were badly mistaken. Upon arrival in the Soviet Union, they were arrested, charged with treason and collaboration with enemies, and sentenced to long terms in labor camps, in some cases 15 years. Only in 1963, during the relative thaw under Khrushchev, did they gain early release, and it was not until 1990, on the eve of the Soviet collapse, that the Russian state formally rehabilitated them and acknowledged that their persecution had been unjust. For the others who remained in Taiwan, the outcome was even darker. The sailor Zorka M. Dimov committed suicide after reported beatings and lack of medical care. Mikhail M. Kalmazan died of illness, and Anatoly V. Kovalev died in a psychiatric institution, their bodies buried far from home. In some families back in the Soviet Union, an urn with ashes would arrive years later with only a terse official notice. Meanwhile, the case of the Tuapse continued to simmer in the background of Cold War diplomacy. The ship itself was never returned. Its cargo had long ago been pumped into Taiwanese storage tanks and consumed. The crew members still held in Taiwan became bargaining chips in a complex triangle between Moscow, Taipei, and indirectly Washington and Beijing. In the late 1960s, the world had changed. The People's Republic of China and the Soviet Union were now bitter rivals. The United States was edging toward a reopening with Beijing. In this new atmosphere, Taipei began to see humanitarian gestures as a way to gain points in the court of world opinion. A well-connected Soviet journalist, Victor Louis, visited Taiwan and met some of the remaining Tuapse sailors, bringing them letters from their families and carrying news of their existence back to Moscow. Over time, a series of quiet arrangements led to the release and resettlement of the last survivors. Some of them ended up in the West, others in the Soviet Union. Others tried to start new lives in places where no one knew what the word Tuapse meant. In the end, the voyage of that tanker stands as one of the strangest Cold War sea stories. A Soviet ship, seized by anti-communist Chinese forces, watched nervously by the U.S. Navy and diplomats, and turned into a floating crossroads where ideology, law, and personal survival collided. For the men on the board, it was not about maps and doctrines. It was about whether they would spend the rest of their lives in a Siberian camp, in an anonymous foreign prison, or walking freely in a world they had only seen through the portholes of their ship. If that had been the only story of Soviet defection at sea, it would already be remarkable. But the Cold War produced other episodes in which a single man took a literal leap from one system to another. And in those moments, American ships, American law, and American technology played a central role. In November 1970, in rough seas off Martha's Vineyard, the Soviet factory ship Sovietskaya Litva lay alongside the U.S. Coast Guard cutter Vigilant. The two crews were there to discuss fishing regulations, a routine, tightly scripted exchange between superpowers. But suddenly, what looked like a normal meeting turned into a desperate run for freedom. A Lithuanian radio operator named Simas Kudirka, long frustrated by discrimination and political repression in Soviet Lithuania, made a decision that would change his life. As the ships rolled side by side, he climbed the rail of the Sovietskaya Litva and jumped, landing hard on the deck of the American cutter. Bruised, shaking, he shouted in broken English that he wanted political asylum. To the astonishment of American sailors standing by, he pleaded, "Siberia is death." In that moment, everything the U.S. government said it believed in during the Cold War, freedom, human rights, the right to escape tyranny, was put to a simple test. A single man had thrown his body across the physical line between two ships. Was he now under American protection, or was he still subject to Soviet demands? The answer, unfortunately, was not what he had hoped for. Confusion reigned on the bridge of the Vigilant and in the operations rooms ashore. Was the cutter considered sovereign U.S. territory for asylum purposes? Could they keep Kudirka without igniting a major diplomatic incident? Washington was slow to provide clear instructions. The local command hesitated.
Meanwhile, the Soviet captain accused Kudirka of theft, claiming he had stolen 3,000 rubles from the ship's safe and demanding his immediate return. Under pressure, American officers made a fateful decision. They allowed a boarding party of Soviet sailors to come aboard the Vigilant, beat Kudirka into submission, and drag him back to the Sovietskaya Litva. American crew members watched in shock as a man who had reached their deck begging for freedom was carried away, bleeding and screaming, in direct contradiction to everything they thought their flag represented. News of the incident, once it reached the press, sparked outrage across the United States. Editorials condemned the Coast Guard's actions. Congressmen demanded investigations. Lithuanian American communities organized protests, accusing the government of betraying a freedom seeker to a brutal regime. What followed is an important part of why Americans can look back on these stories with a complicated but real sense of pride. The system acknowledged that it had failed. Internal reviews by the Coast Guard and the State Department concluded that there had been no clear guidelines, that officers had been unprepared for such a situation, and that the basic moral and political principles at stake had not been properly applied. As a direct result, new rules were issued. If a foreign national set foot on a U.S. government vessel and requested asylum, his claim had to be taken seriously, his safety had to be protected, and any decision to deny asylum had to go through a transparent, higher-level process. For Kudirka himself, the immediate outcome was grim. Returned to Soviet hands, he was tried and sentenced to years in a labor camp, far from his home in Lithuania. But the international uproar would not die down. Activists, journalists, and diplomats kept his name in the public eye. In 1974, under pressure, and with the discovery that through his mother he could claim U.S. citizenship, Soviet authorities released him and allowed him to emigrate to America. His story was turned into books and a television film, a piece of Cold War popular culture that, unlike Soviet propaganda, did not need to be forced on an audience. 15 years later, in 1985, another Soviet sailor made a different kind of leap. His name was Miroslav Medvid. He was a young Ukrainian seaman on the cargo ship Marshal Konev, traveling up the Mississippi River near New Orleans. As the ship moved through U.S. waters, Medvid jumped over the side and swam to shore, carrying documents and a handwritten note pleading for political refuge. U.S. immigration officers detained him and, with the help of an interpreter over the phone, asked why he had come. He said he was seeking asylum, afraid of persecution if he returned to the Soviet Union. But again, politics intervened. President Reagan and General Secretary Gorbachev were preparing for their first summit in Geneva. Some officials feared that granting asylum to a Soviet sailor right then might derail delicate negotiations. Under this cloud, Medvid was taken back toward his ship. According to later accounts, as he approached the Marshal Konev, he panicked, threw himself into the water again, and had to be pulled out once more, this time heavily sedated. He was handed back to Soviet authorities. Once more, the United States faced public criticism for seeming to put geopolitics above the life and liberty of a single man. This time, however, the environment was different. There had already been the lessons of Kudirka. Congressional hearings, statements by the Commission on Security and Cooperation in Europe, and legal analyses all concluded that the interviews with Medvid had been inadequate, that his fear had been evident, and that the principle of non-refoulement, not sending someone back to a place where they might be persecuted, should have carried more weight. So, once again, the system adapted. Procedures were tightened, training improved, and the understanding grew that in the Cold War battle of ideas, how the United States treated one frightened man at a gangway could matter as much as any missile or tank. Meanwhile, on the other side of the Iron Curtain, Soviet citizens, including sailors, continued to be told that American life was built on inequality, crime, and exploitation. Official films showed unemployment lines, slums, and racial conflict. What they did not show were the things every Soviet sailor saw the moment his ship berthed in New York, Rotterdam, or Hamburg. Container cranes loading and unloading with incredible efficiency, highways full of private cars, skylines lit by advertisements for products that never appeared on Soviet store shelves. They did not show the American National Exhibition in Moscow in 1959, where American organizers built a full model suburban home and a gleaming miracle kitchen packed with labor-saving devices, frozen foods, and shiny appliances, and where Soviet citizens lined up for hours to taste American soft drinks and frozen desserts. At that exhibition, Vice President Nixon and Soviet leader Khrushchev traded barbs in what became known as the kitchen debate, arguing over whether American consumer technology or Soviet heavy industry was the true measure of a system's success. For a Soviet sailor who had walked through a Western supermarket with its endless rows of packaged foods, its refrigerated cases full of meat and dairy, its shelves stacked with canned soups, breakfast cereals, and cleaning products, the answer to that question was not an abstract one. He had already seen with his own eyes that the United States was capable of producing and distributing abundance on a scale his own country simply hadn't matched. He had seen American port technology, containerization, forklifts, computerized tracking, making cargo operations faster and more efficient than the often manual, paperwork-heavy processes he knew at home. That did not mean every Soviet sailor wanted to defect. Many were proud of their service, proud of their country's role in defeating Nazi Germany, proud of their achievements in space and science. But for the ones who did consider defecting, the contrast between the modernity they saw in Western ports and the shortages, censorship, and fear they knew at home was a powerful push. They were not just fleeing a political system, they were reaching for a different vision of the future, one that looked a lot more like what they saw on the other side of the harbor. When Americans watch these stories today, the Tuapse sailors caught in the crossfire of Taiwan's navy and Soviet diplomacy, Simas Kudirka leaping onto a Coast Guard cutter, Miroslav Medvid struggling in the Mississippi at night, there's a natural mix of emotions. Pride that people were willing to risk everything to reach a U.S. deck or U.S. soil because they believed that meant a chance at freedom. Shame that in some cases, American institutions did not live up to their own ideals right away, and a deeper respect that over time those institutions could recognize their failures, change their rules, and do better the next time. In the Soviet system, a mistake like the mishandling of a defection did not become a topic for open debate. It became a secret, buried in classified files and hushed conversations. In the American system, it could become a front-page scandal, a congressional hearing, a movie of the week, and from that messy, public process came reforms that made the next defector a little safer. At sea, the difference between those two worlds could be measured in meters, the distance between one hull and another. A Soviet sailor could be close enough to see the label on an American radar screen, the make of a radio, the brand of the boots on a Coast Guardsman's feet. He could hear the hum of Western electronics, the chatter of crews who didn't have to watch every word they said, the calm confidence of officers who knew that if they refused an unlawful order, they had some protection under their own law. For the men on the Tuapse, on the Sovietskaya Litva, on the Marshal Koniev, that difference was not theoretical. It was the line between a system that saw them primarily as instruments of the state and one that, for all its flaws and contradictions, was moving towards seeing them as individuals with rights. Sometimes that line held, sometimes, as in the cases of Kudirka and Medvid, it wavered. But even in those failures, the values at stake were openly discussed, debated, and eventually defended more strongly. In the end, the story of Soviet defection at sea is not just a footnote in Cold War history. It's a reminder that the real front line between freedom and authoritarianism can be as small as the rail of a ship, as simple as the decision of one young sailor to jump from one deck to another. It's a story about how, in a world of nuclear arsenals and superpower summits, the courage of a single person and the character of a single institution can still matter. And it's a story that, when told from an American point of view, should not only stir curiosity and fascination about Soviet fear and control, it should renew a sense of pride in the idea that a society can be open enough to admit its own mistakes, strong enough to correct them, and committed enough to keep its ships, its laws, and its technology pointed, however imperfectly, towards the side of those who choose freedom.